live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about the final episode of Season 2, Assignment Earth. So this is an episode in which the Enterprise goes back in time to 1968, the year that the episode was released, and their stated reason for being there is historical research, but they intercept the transmission of Gary 7 and Isis. So Gary 7 is a human, according to Gary 7, and that's a big part of the problem that Kirk runs into. According to Gary 7, he is a human whose ancestors were taken from Earth thousands of years ago by an incredibly advanced secret civilization from across the galaxy, and basically humans were trained over generation after generation to be sent back to Earth at crisis points when humanity would need some sort of guide, and 1968 is one such crisis point, because the U.S. is launching a suborbital nuclear platform, which will, expand the scope of the nuclear arms race going on during the Cold War and increase tensions, potentially leading to global nuclear war, which is a bad thing, by most accounts. So, Gary 7 essentially claims that his task is to stop Earth from destroying itself in a global nuclear war. But Kirk can't be sure. He is concerned that Gary 7 is an alien, that he's there to sabotage the Earth, that he might be trying to destroy the planet in such a way that the future that leads to the Enterprise existing doesn't happen, etc., etc. Gary 7 manages to escape confinement and beam himself down to Earth. Kirk and Spock pursue him, and there's a lot of sort of spy type stuff where Gary 7, it's a sort of James Bond. There's a James Bond element to this, where high-tech space gadgets and things like that, and using sort of espionage and trickery. And Gary 7 basically ends up sort of aligning himself with Roberta Lincoln who was the secretary of the two agents that had been sent ahead of him, who have died in a car crash. So Gary 7 now has to take up their mission to set this rocket to malfunction so that, nuclear war doesn't happen. And he's got like an hour to do it, which is really, really late in the game for him to have checked up on these agents who have been here apparently for a while. I mean, they died 3 days earlier in a car crash, and they had apparently been there at least long enough to have gotten a secretary. So, just waiting till the last minute on this one. But basically he's trying to sort of infiltrate McKinley Rocket Base, get onto this rocket, set it to malfunction, etc., etc. Kirk and Spock are unsure whether or not they should be aiding or opposing Gary 7, and ultimately Gary 7 gets sort of pulled back. Initially, he's being beamed up to the Enterprise, but then his own transporter, Roberta Lincoln, inadvertently turns on his own transporter, which pulls him back to the apartment he's using as headquarters. So he's trying to destroy this rocket manually. Roberta is like, I'm hitting you in the head with a box because it intuitively seems like a bad thing to me that you're trying to destroy this US rocket. Then Kirk and Spock show up, and Roberta is suddenly on Gary 7's side. And basically, there's a whole back and forth, and Spock, interestingly enough, says that there's no logical way for Kirk to determine whether or not they should trust Gary 7 when he claims he wants to blow up this rocket before it lands in probably around the area of Moscow, thus starting World War III, or whether they should distrust him and assume that Spock should try and destroy this rocket himself. So eventually Kirk just sort of is like, well, yeah, there it is. Gary 7, go for it. Destroy that rocket, which he does. And then everything ends happily. The world powers are sort of frightened out of nuclear war. And the setup at the end of the episode is Kirk basically saying, well, Gary 7 and Roberta Lincoln, I can't tell you everything that our record tapes show, but you're going to have a lot of fun adventures. Which they never did. That was supposed to be the setup for a spin-off, which would follow the adventures of Gary 7 and Roberta Lincoln. That spin-off was never made. So it's just a weird ending to Season 2 that goes nowhere. So there is one major problematic plot element I want to talk about with this before I talk about some social justice things. And that is Spock claims that there is no logical way to determine whether or not they should let Gary 7 blow up the rocket, whether they should trust that he's going to do that, or whether Spock should try in the 90 seconds they have to figure out Gary 7's computer system and destroy this rocket. But there's a perfectly logical way of doing this. Spock essentially says, without more time, I cannot use this computer to destroy the rocket. There is no feasible alternative. I mean, if Spock cannot do it, you do nothing and the rocket goes off, your only option to potentially, that has even the potential of destroying the rocket, is to let Gary 7 do it. And if he locks the controls or something like that so that it can't be destroyed, then you've lost nothing, really. The outcome is functionally the same. Whether Spock fails to destroy the rocket falls because you've done nothing, or Gary 7 locks the controls, is a matter of complete indifference. It does not make any difference. There is no feasible alternative to that would lead to the rocket being destroyed other than trusting Gary 7 to do it. But also, the driving conflict for Kirk throughout is, should we trust that Gary 7 is what he says he is going to do what he says he's going to do, etc., etc. But at the end, Kirk says, we can't reveal everything we know, but you and Miss Lincoln are going to have some exciting adventures. How do you know that if you don't have record tapes that include Gary 7? You can't. You don't know that. So clearly he is in the computer's historical database. You could have checked. You could have just, said, computer, look up any references to Gary 7, and it would have been like, oh, yeah, here's a ton of stuff that this dude did, all of which is really important. Problem solved. There you go. Quandary gone. You could have literally done that, because it's clear that information is clearly available to you. And for whatever reason, even though they sort of call a meeting and are like, what should we do? Nobody apparently thinks to check the historical record tapes. Insanity. Now, social justice stuff in this episode. The big one, obviously, is related to MAD, mutually assured destruction. And, we've talked about this before, because Star Trek deals with this concern in a number of different episodes. MAD was, and to a lesser extent is, but not as much anymore, the idea of MAD was deterrence, that you could prevent a nuclear war, you could prevent nuclear exchange simply by every nuclear power or the bulk of nuclear powers being powerful enough to destroy everyone. So that was the idea, mutually assured destruction. It does exactly what it says on the tin. If anybody launches nuclear weapons, the entire world will be obliterated between the initial strikes and counter-strikes. And so no one would do it. Some might argue that the whole system was dumb and wasteful, and that rather than having to continually hold a gun to the other person's head while they hold a gun to yours, maybe it would be better to just not have the guns. Maybe rather than saying, I'm going to depend on you being too scared of dying to try and kill me, maybe just neither of you try and kill each other. Maybe don't have nuclear weapons. And this is kind of the thing that's the sort of hopeful message of Assignment Earth, is because this rocket with its nuclear warheads explodes 104 miles above the Earth, potentially setting off a nuclear holocaust if it hadn't been exploded. The idea is that the major powers are then frightened out of the nuclear arms race, and they make the decision that should have been made in the first place to simply let nuclear weapons go. And this starts leading toward Earth's sort of peaceful period that eventually contributes to the universe of Star Trek. So there is a very positive, hopeful element to this. And the fact that it really didn't happen that way, in a sense, is very sad. Because, we did have nuclear brinksmanship. The Cuban Missile Crisis being one of the most well-known examples. And the fact that we were very, very close to global destruction at that point was not sufficient to persuade world leaders that the pursuit of nuclear weapons was a foolhardy arrangement. In fact, there are still people in U.S. politics today, for instance, who claim that we should be building more nuclear weapons, we should be upgrading our facilities, we should be doing more nuclear stuff, even though we could destroy this planet multiple times over. This just insane lust for power is incredibly detrimental to society as a whole. So that's the biggest thing here, but we also have a sort of odd panoptic component to this, because Gary 7 has this incredibly powerful computer, a Beta 5, I forget exactly what the full name of it is, but it's a Beta 5 computer, which of course means nothing, it's a random thing, but it's apparently an incredibly powerful, sophisticated computer with basically a kind of artificial intelligence. But it's also able to be incredibly knowledgeable and even invasive. The computer is able to search all existing records, including apparently even newspaper records, which is interesting because in 1968 there wasn't something like the internet where where newspapers would be digitized and be searchable electronically. So somehow this computer is able to search through physical newspapers to find out that the other two agents who were sent ahead of Gary 7 have been killed in a car crash. But it's also used on Roberta Lincoln. Because at one point after she arrives, Gary 7 initially Gary 7 initially mistakes her for the female agent who was working on this project. When he figures out that she isn't that agent, he asks the computer to tell him who she is. And the computer gives her name, her occupation, where she lives. It gives her height and weight, and it even describes a couple of moles that she has on her body. That's information that's not going to be available digitally, so clearly this has some kind of scanning mechanism, and it uses that scanning mechanism on the body of a young woman, which raises troubling questions, both from a sort of panoptic AI-driven concern in terms of privacy rights and user data and things like this, even at the physical level. And I mean, face recognition technology is now a thing. Face recognition technology is now a thing that can link to a profile that has been created of you from your digital footprint. But this appears to go even beyond that, to sort of scan the physical body. And again, the fact that it's scanning the body of a woman whose bodies across patriarchal society tend to be much more subject to observation, much more subject to scrutiny, much more subject to the gaze in psychoanalytic terminology. It's an incredibly problematic use of that technology.